thank you all for such very interesting and lucid papers. And you're doing very well without the chair, actually. I would have questions for you, and you would have questions for each other, and you could easily use the last remaining 23 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves. But I'm sure there are questions from the audience or comments from the audience to where we should take that first. Please.
Thank you. This was a fantastic way to start. Fantastic content. Justin, you and I talked about Sutzkever's works in detail together, and the field of Sutzkever would be nothing without Justin Cammy, everyone who knows that. I want to just raise a few directions to add regarding the Vilna Ghetto. One is the difference between the original manuscript, which is in the Jewish Anti-Fascist Community Archive, and the different versions of, published versions of it. I take those differences very seriously. They do not relate, by the way, to Jewish particularity. They do not relate to universalism. They relate to more surprising topics. We can discuss that later. Secondly, I just don't think that it's a flat work. I think it's very poetic. I think it's stylistically fascinating. I think that what prevents, in part, contemporary readers from appreciating that richness is that we don't have the genre of reportage anymore. Reportage, historically, in East Europe, in Jewish Eastern Europe, was one of the favorite genres of the time. And in this sense, Sutzkever's reportage, this is a collection of reportage essays, was not alone. Paczynski, Zelkovich, and if you read the newspapers, in Russian and in Yiddish at the time, reportage was the bread and butter, and I just think that we don't have access to that in the same way. And you hinted at this, but lastly, the Cold War politics. It's embarrassing that Sutzkever, and I'm overstepping what I can prove, but I think he was embarrassed about his Soviet chapter to a certain extent, and he was disappointed too, especially when it's a combination of embarrassment and disappointment, perhaps, and we can go over this. I'm just raising this suggestion that it's not cool to have been passionate about being a Soviet Jew, and for good reason, because if you look at what's edited out of his work, there was censorship, and if you look at what happens to his compatriots there, they were all murdered, put in prison, and murdered. So he's kind of embarrassed about that, and his publishers and Americans are obviously really embarrassed about that. And that's it. I just want to bring that up.
So
I want to say something too.
Yeah. So Chana Pauline Galai's work is the most exciting work that's going on. No, right now on these particular questions, especially the period, Sutzkever's Soviet period. I've benefited a lot from not only her previous articles but also her sharing of things that she's discovered. And I think you're right on all three counts. On the one hand, what you're really saying is that there are generic differences between a contemporary, let's say, American readership and a European Yiddish readership make his memoir illegible in some ways, not meaningful. The only problem with that is, and I completely agree, is then how to get around some of not only the reality of Sutzkever's later career, but also the evidence of his own disassociation from it. So is it that he's disassociated because of the embarrassment of the Cold War stuff that you're talking about, or is there something where he's actually moved away and no longer recognizes the usefulness of the reportage genre? So I think that's something that has to be acknowledged. In terms of the manuscripts, what's really interesting is that the translations of Von Vilna Ghetto that exist in other languages, as far as I can tell, did not go back to the original manuscript, and didn't even translate from the Soviet edition. They translated from the Paris edition.
This does.
Yeah.
So Justin has co-edited a wonderful new translation of you used the Paris edition.
No, I didn't use it. The editors did, but I'm going to.
And Buenos Aires.
And the Buenos Aires. In the English edition that I'm doing, I am going to I'm going to do variants and see where the difference, because there's also differences in there are entire paragraphs and sentences, pages that are left out.
Photos are different.
Absolutely.
I just want to piggyback just to relate there has been, in the last, I'd say, 15 years, a very important sort of corrective in terms of the binary about the nature of totalitarian writing, right? So, and this is going on in terms of reassessment of someone like Beryl Mark, right? So I think that the question of, and all the new work, Harriet Murov's work and Polly Zavadicker's work on, Ehrenberg and Vasily Gross, the question of what's censored, how useful are these memoirs and things written under occupation, etc. So I think that it's always worth doing, but there's so many strands that have to be unpacked now. But certainly, he might have been embarrassed. Cold War politics plays a role, but still, these are useful, absolutely useful documents. And also to being caught as a Polish Jew in Soviet times, it saved his life. Yeah, it saved his life. So anyway, I just think it's so, it's very rich right now to sort of reconsider all of these materials. And I would say something about Davidovich on that. She couldn't do it. That's what's so interesting. Yeah. As an American who was a liberal Cold Warrior, who worked for 2 decades at the most important American Jewish defense agency, that's the American Jewish Committee, that spent its energies in the 50s distancing American Jewish culture from communism, which I actually think they should have done that personally, but it meant creating Jewish culture as a religion, which fit into the American tri-faith post-war conception of Jews. It meant that she could not understand at all what was going on for Jewish culture activists in the harness of the Eastern Bloc. And she remains, I didn't talk about this, but in her memoir, in the very beginning, she says that what the Nazis destroyed, the Soviets finished. So she can only think in black and white. And it gets her into a lot of political fights with people later in her life.
I have 4 watermelon. Are you with us?
Oh yes, I was very moved just by the quotations you used also from the diary. I don't know the diary, and I would love
the memoir.
Memoir,
yeah.
Yes. To have the translation of it in Polish. But this fragment about the sun,
I know, kills us.
when you put it in separate verses,
right,
it's like a very powerful poem. And I remember the poem, Hero about the sun. But it would be amazingly interesting to compare the writing after with the distance, with emotions, because he uses emotions in his poems, but with this Holocaust time writing without any emotions, and as a kind of poetry.
So to poeticize the memoir, and then there's the other. What's been so fascinating about this volume, which I'm sort of I find translating a way to escape in some ways from thinking. So sometimes I do translation as a way to get to thinking, even though translation is an art in and of itself. And I can't tell you how many fights I've had about this one document. One of the things that is interesting is that, just to what you're saying, is that all of the translations that I've seen, except one, only translate the memoir. Right? That they might come with an afterword. None of them do what one might expect. Go through the memoir and say, where are the 12 or 15 moments in the memoir that he also writes later about or earlier about in his poetry? And then also include in an appendix the actual poems so that you could actually look at the poem Zum Kind at the same time that you do that. None of them include his testimony, a translation of his testimony at Nuremberg with the diary. None of them go back to his later volume of collected writings and translate his diary entries from his testimony at Nuremberg, along with the testimony at Nuremberg, along with the memoir itself as one sort of testimonial document. I'm still playing with that. Definitely I'm going to do the memoir. I'm not sure I'm up to doing the poetry with it, but I certainly want to include the two Nuremberg pieces. And that's also controversial, because people are saying that those are also postures, those are also self-conscious presentations, that the memoir or the reportage is one thing, and to include the testimony and then the much later notes on the testimony would somehow distract from all of this. The other idea that I've had, and this is something, is that what he also writes much later 3 essays on Soviet Yiddish and Jewish writers who he met while he was in Moscow. Why couldn't you have a volume of translations that included von Vilna Ghetto and 3 essays on Yiddish writers who are later also murdered in the Soviet Union, as sort of a memorial to both what the Nazis destroyed and to what the Soviets destroyed? There's a lot of possibilities there. And I'm sort of just I'm sort of just in the middle of the translation, and then I'm moving along to. But the poeticizing of the actual memoir is not something that I've moved towards yet.
But the major question is how to write about such experience. And in each language we had this discussion. In Polish language, there were many writings about Auschwitz, like Fleszerowa Muscat or Naukowska, full of emotions, which today is hardly to read. And then you have Tadeusz Borowski, which is very to the fragment you wrote, which is another way of not using any emotions, but write about this experience in a very direct, realistic way. Yes, that's what I sense from the fragment.
Next is our good colleague and beloved host, Jan.
So thank you. A great start for today.
Thank you.
And what I actually want to say about this whole discussion about the memoirs is that one of the things when I started to work on this book here, I had this ambition. I wanted to translate the memoirs in one volume and then the prose in another volume. The Hopen Erzählungen in another volume. And then I actually talked to several colleagues, including Avrom, and he had the same response as you presented. Don't bother with the memoirs, but there's a volume of Sutzkever's essays in Yiddish, Leinen Pennemer, by Leinen Pennemer, and there are some very interesting essays there, particularly about the Soviet period, and I should translate some of them. So, to make a long story short, I didn't really have the time and the resources to do. I wanted to do this double project with them. I was in touch with you about it, but I didn't have the the stamina to do it. So I decided to focus on these stories that I'm going to talk about later today. And I actually translated an excerpt from the memoirs. And I agree with Hannah that they have a certain poetry to them. They have a certain, this is a particular genre, and they're actually very powerful. They're very kind of reportage, not very evocative, but very kind of matter of fact and interesting in that way. And I also translated this poem, Cirque, Circus. And what I think is interesting, and I'm not, I can go on and on about this, but the thing is that he actually published these memoirs in 44, 45, and he came to Nuremberg and gave testimony in early part of 46. So this was his public persona, and we can discuss it. It was constrained by political consideration. He was in the Soviet delegation. He had to follow a certain script there, of course. But interestingly, the more powerful psychological response, which is Circus, that I read yesterday in Danish, is he did not release that until 79.
Right.
In that volume, Die erste Nacht im Ghetto.
So,
and one of the things that is so interesting about that is that when we talk about this, is the particular time for publication is highly significant. There is a time for everything. Right after the Holocaust, these were the kind of the memoirs, these very naked documentary eyewitness accounts, were what was kind of expected, or this was the genre, right? Later on, with the passage of time, you could kind of open up for that very complicated, emotional, traumatic experience in a poem like this, and also some of these stories that I translated. So this is a...
it sounds like all three of you agree. Just not to distract from Cecile and Nancy, but just to the point of the poetry of the reportage is what all three of you are suggesting. You've just mentioned the poem Der Zirk, right? And I mentioned it in my talk. I won't read the whole description of that, but here's the translation from the memoir of that exact episode.
FYI, that's also in the Nuremberg testimony.
Yeah,
right.
It is exactly
Yes.
that.
We arrived at the old synagogue on Vilkomir. The Germans had gathered a crowd for the spectacle. They were waiting for us. The SS were swinging the cane of an old man and pushing us towards the wall of the synagogue and ordered us to undress. I saw the floor was covered with profaned Sefer Torahs, covered with tire barks. Other Sefer Torahs were tossed into the mix with their embroidered velour covers, torn and covered with blood. Next to them were planks gathered for a bonfire. Get undressed. A thought crossed my mind. They intended to burn us alive. I turned towards the other man, and his look calmed me. The young boy was crying for his mother. The Gestapo agent removed his revolver and repeated the order, "Get undressed." An SS man lit a match and ignited the bonfire. And I could go on. So to the extent that we read these things as poetic prose, that's where really the intersection of the literary analysis of Sutzkever and the historical analysis of Sutzkever come together. And just before we get to, I have to say on your remarks and intersecting with your introductory remarks, I mean what your presentation taught me today about the hooliganism of the masses and the role of academics is frightening. Not only for what it says about Lucy Davidovich and Poland, but what it says about our current moment. And I just hope that when your book comes out and as you speak about this, people can hear and read and understand what you're really saying more than just what you're specifically talking about.
I think just on that, I think it's very. I would say it's very complicated. Again, we're in a European context here where. I may be wrong about this, but where the legacy of the Horben still informs a more nuanced view of Jewish political power in the United States because it's the United States and because of the centrality and the systematic, horrifying discrimination of people of color. The Holocaust consciousness doesn't play that role, and therefore someone like Lucy Davidovich, who becomes very critical of the post-colonial critique of the modern state of Israel, is now seen as just an apologist. So I'm not so sanguine that lessons that a European audience might draw from a suspicion of intellectual dissemination of ideas that penetrate to masses that create hooligans is actually going to be understood in the same way in the United States, and also plays out differently in the United States, at least right now. Look, populism is this one of these words like liberalism that has no meaning because means everything, but at least today, just to be very contemporary, the perception of American populism is that it's part of the American tradition of anti-intellectualism, thinking about Richard Hofstadter, the sort of the anti-intellectualism of American public is what is leading to the right wing. That's different than in Europe, I think.
I can see I won't get to my questions because we have this time five, and the first of those is Thomas Brudholm. Now it has to be brief, also the answers.
Yes. Brief. So very briefly, Nancy, the indictment of Hitler's professors at that time, to what degree, if any, did it include indictment of scholarship in science more generally? I'm thinking of Bauman's critique of science at that time, or Merton's reflection on science and ethics and democracy about the same time. So that brief now. The other brief point is that because I was completely sidestepped by Christoph comment, because I think the discussion about emotion and academic style and history writing is really interesting. And it reminds me of Hannah Arendt's response to the critique that she was overly emotional. And I think we need, and this is not what we need, a discussion of, I mean, I think you can be overly emotional and you can also be deficiently emotional. And I think the idea of objectivity as something direct of emotion is misleading. Yeah. It speaks back to a misleading idea of the relationship between reason and emotion. So I completely agree. This is my last line. Lucian Amari, another Holocaust survivor, who said that enlightenment could not proceed detachedly. It has to.
So
but that was
not a question.
No. So all I would say is everything you say is she writes. Davidovich writes about this, by the way. I give a paper called Against Sentiment. She was very suspicious of sentimentality, and I have so much evidence for this. But sentimentality does not mean dispassion. So that's the and her memoir makes you weep, and so because it's written in such a way that the reality of what has befallen Vilna Jewry is so felt. So, but she talks also about Weinreich. They weren't histrionic, they weren't sentimentalized, they weren't wasn't Steven Spielberg. That's not the word. But I also think the Enlightenment is passionate. I've never accepted this binary. Weinreich, I think, does not criticize scholarship in general. It is really an indictment of German scholarship and the particular relationship of German national scholarship to anti-Semitism. And he remains devoted to scholarship his whole life. It's all he can do.
Yeah, if I could just
wait, Cecile.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Nancy. I mean, Weinreich was very deeply committed to this idea of scholarship as a tool for addressing social problems and addressing political problems. And I would agree that I think, that his critique of German scholarship was very personal because he himself was trained at Marburg, and, he saw this as a personal betrayal as well as a betrayal of the ideal of Wissenschaft. But I don't think it really extended to a larger critique because, to his core, he felt that, what Wissenschaft should be was something worth upholding. And I would just add to that it's interesting that almost all YIVO publications that appeared in other languages, for example, specifically in English, in the New York period appeared first in Yiddish and then were translated. But Hitler's Professors was first published in Yiddish in sections, but the first publication in book form was in English before it was published in book form in Yiddish. And I think that speaks to the fact that Weinreich, saw this as something imperative. It was published in 1946, right? And, that to reach as quickly as possible, as large an audience as possible outside the usual, Jewish circles who would be reading YIVO publications, because he saw this as something imperative to get the message of the book out to the larger public.
I just wanted to strongly object to the idea that people from the ghettos and the forest and the Lithuanian division, Litowska Divizja, in any way were ashamed of the fact that they were serving in the Soviet Union. I spent 40 years married to a woman that her father was a soldier in the Litowska Divizja. I knew Alexander Bogen, I knew Abba Kovner, and they never, ever rejected or were ashamed. That they were terribly proud of the fact that they actually fought. An example, a commander in my military unit in the Israeli army was Colonel Arad, who was a commander in Narush forest, I think. And at one occasion we had just a drink, I think it was the Independence Day of 70 or 69, and we just had a drink and he just sang the song Wypiją za rodzinę, wypiją za Stalin.
Yeah, that's why Alexander Bogin and Sutzkever didn't get along, because Sutzkever was a sort of embarrassed, and that had in part to do with his relationship to the Histadrut and to the international scholarly community. He was different from the other members of that
Maybe
in that sense.
I never sort of, but the atmosphere in this
absolutely.
meetings and this was always
Yeah,
they
and
so Russian, they
Sutzkever
felt
distanced
very
himself from that clique. So,
I think we will take the rest of the comments and then very short responses from you. Yes.
Just a short suggestion about the circumstances of writing and publishing this Sutzkever's memoir. I think there's a need for an archival research in Moscow, because the answers about Sutzkever's cautiousness and all the other circumstances of publication should lie in the archives of Soviet Writers' Union and also Lithuanian Writers' Union. Sutzkever was a member of the Lithuanian Writers' Union, Soviet Writers' Union as well, and all the texts went through very formal procedures of approval, of evaluation, of a collective discussion, and there should be answers about the censorship and self-censorship and so on. So I think that should be done, and I also would support this idea that the memoir has an aesthetics of its own, and so particular an aesthetics of absence, of silence, which could be compared with famous Holocaust memoirs by Elie Wiesel, Prime Lele, and so on. You? Yeah, you will have comments after.
Well, sorry, the point I was interested in also saying that I think the memoir is fantastically fruitful from the psychological point of view in looking at the memoir and the poetry together. And I think it's very significant that with this discussion of Der Zirk, that he published in, I think, 1949, I've forgotten the exact date, a poem also describing this incident called Erev mein Verbrennung, which really sublimates the whole and mythologizes the whole incident and has a completely different mood to it and ending. And I think it's really taking these three accounts together. I have actually tried to compare them in an article I wrote a few years ago. Gives a very, very strong insight. And I think that the whole memoir is full of this kind of material, which really is very illuminating for the poetry as well, for an understanding of the poetry.
And you?
Yes.
This will be the last question.
Very, very, very short commentary. Two things. I mean, there is no contradiction between, as someone said, between his poetry and the memoirs, because that was, you can see Ehrenburg, for example, or Grossman. They were excellent writers, prosa writers, with much poetry and all that stuff. And they were writing the Black Book, and they were Pravda correspondents during the war, with excellent reportage. That was one thing. The other thing is that this was censorship. He was writing this between 44, 45, because it was printed 46 in Moscow. And that was a time when the censorship was on a low grade. So he should be ashamed of this censorship. The only thing that he mentioned to me was
I had to write in the Soviet style with taking away the Hebrew words and the spelling and all that stuff.
So at this end, I would leave 2 minutes for every one of you to answer, comment, wind up, and this would leave us within, I think, a margin of surpassing our limit that is still compatible with Swedish standards.
Well, I have just one little thing. I want to just comment what Cecile said, and this relates to your question. So one of the last things that Lucy Davidovich or Liebe Schildka did for Max Weinreich is she recovered his original dissertation from the University of Marburg, and was able to ship it to him. And then it was published later by Gerald Fracas, is up there later, Studies in Yiddish Language. And in 1960, he was invited to get an honorary degree from the University of Marburg, and he declined. So I think that tells you where he stood on the German Academy.
You want me to?
If you want to.
Well, I mean, just to comment perhaps on Justin's paper, I mean, I'm just, I was interested just sort of relating, I mean, there's many fascinating things that, as the discussion showed, that your paper raised, but relating it, to my talk, I was intrigued by, your evocation of Heiko Lunsky's memoir, from the Vilna Ghetto, which he writes, as you noted, in the wake of, of World War I, and of course, the destruction of World War I, in a certain sense, as terrible as that was at the time, and of course, when he wrote it, no one knew what was coming later, but, kind of set the stage for kind of this cultural flowering for the brief interwar period, and, the destruction that Sutzkever was describing was, of course, very different, but it was interesting to me that, of sort of juxtaposing the two, and I'm just wondering if you think that he was writing with that kind of historical frame, if this was, something that you brought in your interpretation, or if he was sort of saw himself as, his work in sort of this larger, sort of frame of Vilna Jewish traditions I described.
I don't see how he couldn't have thought about it. And he was certainly familiar with all of the previous books, going back to the 19th century, sort of the general historical hagiographies of Vilna. I see him as fitting into that. I think that what's so interesting about what your work and your presentation sort of suggests is this triangle desire that you set up between traditional Vilna, the new institutions that are established in Pohulanka, and I know since I've read your work, what you weren't able to get to, the working class neighborhoods, across the river, either in Zarecho or in Schnippeschick, and sort of the relationship between these three, the sort of tradition, intellectual modernity, sort of neo-bourgeois, and also working class Yiddish, and how all those three come together to answer the question that you end up answering in your book that you started your talk with on sort of why Vilna, and of course the answer that you provide and that others have written about Weinreich is this question of genius of place, right? So, and this is something that's haunted me since I started writing about Vilna. What does this mean? What does it mean when people say that a place has genius? I mean, is that possible? Sort of that somehow Vilna possessed genius of place. Is this just a poetic mythologization? Is this actually true? Why Vilna and not Kovna? Why Kovna and not Warsaw? Why Warsaw? What is that? So your paper sort of elicits the question and then allows us all to continue that discussion.
That sounds like a very, very good question to think about.
Over lunch.
Whatever we are going to use the common break for. But thank you so much.
Okay.